Well, a warm welcome to all the current students, faculty, staff, and alumni in the room and on Zoom. Exactly 90 years ago today, the first students walked through the doors of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Let's take a moment to consider the world as it was in 1933. World War I had ended 15 years prior, and the League of Nations established in 1920. The year before Fletcher's founding, the World Disarmament Conference was convened in 1932 with representatives from 62 states, but it failed to reach an agreement. At the time, there was a focus on diplomacy, preventing future wars, which sadly did not happen, establishing international law, disarmament, and fostering dispute resolution mechanisms and conflict resolution. All of these concerns, of course, remain relevant today at Fletcher and in the world, and many new challenges have arisen. As we celebrate Fletcher today, alumni around the world, from Asia to Africa, Europe to South America, and from the East Coast to the West Coast here in the United States, are gathering at more than 30 alumni club events and posting images to our Fletcher Day social media campaign around the world with Fletcher. In fact, I've already gotten my first photo texted to me from the Alumni Club in London, so really exciting. It's an immense pleasure for me to welcome our two speakers today, and our time together is short, so I will keep the introductions brief. And Gabe, can we put them up on the screen? Thank you. There he is, Nicholas Burns, is ambassador to the United States of the United States of America. So happy to see you. Nicholas Burns is ambassador of the United States of America to the People's Republic of China. Ambassador Burns is on a public service leave from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where he was Goodman Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations until 2021, and he founded the school's Future of Diplomacy project. During his long career in American diplomacy, he served 6 presidents and 9 secretaries of state. And most recently, he was a member of the Foreign Policy Advisory Board of Secretary of State John Kerry. He was also Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 2005 to 2008, where he led numerous negotiations, including on the U.S.-India civil nuclear deal, a long-term military assistance agreement with Israel, and on Iran's nuclear program. He previously served as ambassador to NATO, ambassador to Greece, and State Department spokesman. And I have to say, I recently visited the U.S. Embassy in Beijing and was delighted to discover Fletcher alumni working under Ambassador Burns in the embassy. Winston Lord served as U.S. Ambassador to China from 1985 under President Reagan, and he served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 1993 to 1997 under President Bill Clinton. In the 1970s, he was Special Assistant to National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, and then was Director of the State Department Policy Planning Staff. During this period, he was on every China trip and attended every meeting that President Nixon, President Ford, and Dr. Kissinger had with President Mao Zedong, Premier Zhou Enlai, and Deputy Premier Deng Xiaoping. And he was a principal drafter of both the 1972 Shanghai Communique and the 1973 Paris Peace Accords. In the 1960s, Ambassador Lord served in the Pentagon and Foreign Service. And outside of government, his service has included being president of the Council on Foreign Relations, co-chairman of the International Rescue Committee, and chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm joined here in the room by Professor Sulmaan, Associate Professor of International History and Chinese Foreign Relations. He received his MA and PhD from Yale University, and his most recent book is Haunted by Chaos, China's Grand Strategy from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping. And I think you all know who I am, but just to be clear, I am Kelly Sims Gallagher, Dean ad interim of the Fletcher School. I'm also a professor of energy and environmental policy And related to this event, I served in the Obama administration as senior policy advisor in the White House and in the State Department, and helped lead the negotiations between the United States and China on climate change, which led to the joint announcement in 2014 and the joint statement in 2015. So without further ado, a warm welcome to both of our ambassadors. It's wonderful to see you on the screen. We're going to begin with a conversation between Professor Khan and Ambassador Lord, and then switch to a conversation between me and Ambassador Burns, and then they will interact with each other, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So get ready with your own questions. And now I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Khan.
So it's cliche to say it's an honor to be here, but it genuinely is an honor to be here. This is a company that's so distinguished that I don't quite know how I stumbled into it. So if I seem a little starstruck, that's what's going on over here. I should say part of the reason is Ambassador Lord's presence. If you do anything on diplomatic history, and if you do anything on diplomatic history related to China, you come across Ambassador Lord's name at just about every key moment in the US-China relationship. And when we were trying to go through what we could and couldn't cover today, we realized that this could have lasted 2 days and we still wouldn't have exhausted everything Ambassador Lord had to share with us. So Winston, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to meet you, even if on Zoom. I'm going to dive right into it. There's a lot of US-China history to cover, but even before we get to the episode you're arguably most famous for, and that's Henry Kissinger's secret trip to China. Before that, there was virtually no contact between the US and China. You take the Warsaw talks out of it, and the two sides don't really know one another that much. So what I want to ask is, what was your experience of planning China policy just before the trip? How did the complete absence of contact affect that planning?
Well, first of all, thank you for the introductions. Fletcher, Nick Burns, China, that's a triple offer that I couldn't refuse. One of the happiest and most productive times of my life was my year at Fletcher, not only getting ready for my career, but also finding my future wife. Betty Bao took very good notes in economics class. That was my weak subject, so I decided to become her friend. So far, their marriage has lasted 60 years. I think it's going to last a little longer. As for Nick, I'll say what I say behind his back. He is simply one of the 3 or 4 most outstanding diplomats of his generation. His global experience and context is perfect for this time in US-Chinese relations, which has to be seen in a global context, and he's doing a terrific job under very difficult circumstances. As for China, I think Nick would agree with me that we have to be humble about particularly what's going to happen in China in the future. And before answering your question, very quickly, to prove my humility, was an episode in the late 1980s. Betty and I went to a Buddhist temple near Beijing. The head monk came out and his eyes lit up when he heard I was the American envoy and my wife was a best-selling author. So he said, would you two do a distinct service to guide and instruct our future visitors to this temple? Would you write something in English for that purpose? And we, of course, were thrilled. He went off, and this is an honor reserved for poets, scholars, philosophers, great statesmen. Betty started composing poetic couplets. I was composing Kissingerian maxims. The monk came back and said, with 2 ornate wooden plaques, and he said to Betty and me, would you write in English to guide our future visitors? On this plaque, the word ladies' room. On that plaque, the word men's room. So that showed that we really didn't know what was going on in China. Now to answer your question, yes, we had been separated for 22 years, fought in Korea, mutual hostility. So we had 2 challenges to get in touch and begin a new relationship. Incentives on both sides for us to improve relations with Moscow by getting their attention, to get help to end the Vietnam War, to stabilize Asia, to lift the spirits of the American people who are going through a different decade, and to show the world we could act and we weren't mired down in a quagmire. China wanted to break out of its diplomatic isolation and also wanted to balance the near barbarian, the Soviet Union, with relations with the far barbarian United States. So we had to operate in two tracks. One was the public one to begin signal to various audiences, our own, the Chinese, other countries, that we're ready to move in a new direction. And so in various speeches and presidential reports, we paid attention to nomenclature like calling the country not Communist China, but the People's Republic of China, indicating that we wanted a new relationship, taking unilateral steps to relax modestly some travel and trade restrictions, sending that signal. So that was the public part of it, to condition various audiences. Privately, we had to figure out a way to get in touch with the Chinese. We tried various channels like France and Romania. We ended up with the Pakistani channel. They were a friend of both sides. So Joe and I would send a message to the Pakistanis. The president of Pakistan would send it to his ambassador in Washington. He would come into Kissinger's office, and Henry and I would get the message and then draft a response. And we finally settled on Henry's secret trip, but only after we insisted that the agenda be broader than just Taiwan, which was the Chinese initial position.
So take us through your impressions of that famous secret trip. You invoked your wife, and I understand the trip was so secret that even she was kept out of the loop. So what was it like planning a secret trip, and what did it achieve?
Well, she wasn't completely kept out of the loop. I shared everything with my wife because I was going off in secret negotiations with the Vietnamese, the Russians, the Middle East. I had to explain what I was doing. And Henry knew that and knew she could be trusted for discretion. But he came to me and said, on this trip, it is so sensitive, and your wife is Chinese. If there's any leaks, you're going to be blamed for it. So you cannot tell her about this trip. I promised Henry I wouldn't. And then I had to figure out how I could tell her without breaking my promise. So the night before we went on the trip, it was a public trip to 4 other nations, ending up in Pakistan for the secret disembarkation for Beijing. So I went to the window of our home, looked out. In those days, the capital of China was Peking, not Beijing. So I said to Betty, pointing out the window, look, I think I see a Peking Tom. He, of course, figured out what I was trying to indicate. I didn't see anything further, so I could honestly say to Henry, I had not told her about it, but of course she knew about it. In any event, that's how I resolved that dilemma. We took off in a small plane, and I had the challenge of managing 3 different sets of briefing books. The ones before us going into China with 2 Secret Service agents had to have all the talking points as well as the background. Another set for a small group of those who were going to cover for us in Pakistan, had to know we were going in, but didn't need the details. And then for the majority on the plane, a book for people who didn't even know we were going into China. And just as I would get to sleep updating the books, Henry would wake up, and of course he's never satisfied with anything. So I had to redo all of them. It was exhausting, but exhilarating. Anyway, very quickly, we took off from Pakistan after a banquet in the middle of the night on the president of Pakistan's plane. On the plane were 4 Chinese that Joe and I had sent down to greet us, and the Secret Service was so surprised they almost went for their pistols. But as we're flying, this was the most dramatic moment in my career. This was going to be a geopolitical earthquake. We're going to meet Joe and I and other Chinese leaders. It was James Bond's Secrecy from the World, and my wife was born in Shanghai, and I was returning to her native land. What was Henry concentrating on? He was ranting and raving because his staff assistant had forgotten to pack any shirts for this momentous occasion. I, of course, told Henry he hadn't started negotiating yet with the Chinese, and he had already lost his shirt. So in any event, he borrowed one from a staff assistant who was about 6'3", and Henry went around looking like a penguin. And the shirt had a label that said, "Made in Taiwan." While this fracas was going on, I took advantage of the distraction to go to the front of the plane so that as we went into Chinese airspace, Henry was in the back, I was in the front, and I could claim forever that I was the first American official in China for 22 years. The trip itself, very quickly, we had two objectives. One, to make sure that a presidential visit made sense. The trip had to be secret because we didn't want to raise expectations. It was very tricky and it might have been a big flop. And secondly, all the countries around the world would be hemming us in, and the Congress would trying to restrict our flexibility in negotiating with the Chinese. So we had to find out through discussions that there was enough there to justify a trip, and then negotiate a communique announcing it. The first was achieved, and so we agreed there should be a trip, and then the communique was very brief because it spoke for itself. It was so dramatic. Basically, it had to reconcile the Chinese desire to show that Nixon was anxious to come to China, and they were gracious enough to welcome him. And we wanted to make it look like the Chinese were anxious to have Nixon visit China, and we were gracious enough to accept. We split the difference, and then we made the announcement a few days later, and it had a tremendous impact on the world.
Well, tell us now about that presidential visit.
Well, the president went, of course, in February 1972. We set it up with another public trip in October 71 to pave the way in terms of logistics, where he would visit, the security arrangements, the media arrangements, et cetera. And also to further the agenda discussion to pave the way for presidential talks and to begin working on a communique, because as Nick as well knows, and everyone should know, that on a major high-level wire act like we may see in November at APEC between Xi and Biden, you work on in advance the results, usually in a communique. So in October, we gave Zhou Enlai a draft communique, which was realistic about our differences, but tried to stress the positive and the convergence. Zhou Enlai came back the next day, having seen Mao, and almost literally threw our draft on the floor. He said, "This is unrealistic. We fought each other in Korea. We've been enemies for 22 years. And now you want to come by our communique. Let's try a different approach. Each side state its views on philosophy and on specific issues. And then where we can agree, it'll have more credibility. This will reassure our friends and domestic audiences and to be more credible." It was a brilliant move. And we recognized that, but we also were nervous because we only had 48 hours. Henry instructed me to rewrite the whole communique till 4 a.m. and then he took over then, and we did it, and we managed to pull that off. So that was setting for the presidential visit. Let me say that I've worked for several presidents, as has Nick, and I've never seen anybody work as hard for a summit as Nixon did for that summit. I was in charge of assembling the briefing books. We had 6 about this thick. I know he read every page because there were marks on every page. As we flew to China, he kept sending notes to the back of Air Force One of more information. So he handled himself extremely well. Now, the highlight of that trip, of course, was the Nixon-Mao meeting. Right after we landed, Zhou Enlai came back to the guest house and said the chairman wanted to see the president. This is like the emperor summoning you in the middle of the night without warning. But we were delighted because he's putting his stamp of approval on the whole opening right at the beginning, not reserving it for the end. So Nixon asked Kissinger to go as national security advisor. Kissinger, to my everlasting gratitude, asked me to go with him because I'd been central to the effort and I was a good note taker. So we go to the trip, and I'll quickly talk about the substance, but let me just say at the end of the meeting, the Chinese came in with a communique with the 3 of our names on it and with photos. Nixon turned to Zhou Enlai and said, "Mr. Lord was never at this meeting. Take him out of the communique, take him out of the photos," which they did. My ego was a little dented, but I understood. The Secretary of State was not there. It was humiliating enough for him to have the national security advisor there, but not him. But to have a 30-year-old punk there as well as the third person was just too much. So the rest of the world did not know that I was there secretly until several years later, although my wife knew. Now, very quickly on the substance of this historic meeting, we came away somewhat disappointed initially because Mao spoke in brushstrokes, not in the elegant discourse that we were used to with Zhou Enlai. And therefore, he would go seemingly at random from one topic to another. But we realized later, as we negotiated with Zhou Enlai in the coming days, that Mao had skillfully touched on each of the key issues very briefly, but established a structure through which Joe and I and we could work over the coming days. So he would say that the Taiwan issue could take 100 years. He would say the polar bear, namely the Soviets, were a problem, that he hadn't changed many things around Beijing, showing he had some resistance, that the Chinese would fire empty cannons in their propaganda, which means they had to go through the motions. So that was enough, and it turned out to be a brilliant laying of the structure. And the final note I'll make is the Joe and Lai persona. During these meetings, and I was in 5 meetings with Mao eventually, Joe and Lai was always entirely silent, deferential, almost obsequious. That's how he survived as number 2, I'm sure. And he was a great actor because he was in the same production of Ibsen's Dollhouse playing Nora as my Chinese father-in-law when they were together at a school in Tianjin. So that was a dramatic meeting, and I was very privileged to be there.
So Dean Gallagher, who also speaks in elegant brushstrokes, just reminded me that we have way overshot our mark. So I want to compress a gazillion questions into one and fast forward to your ambassadorship. These are the Deng years. How has China changed? And what were you seeing that might have foreshadowed what happened at Tiananmen Square?
Well, I was very fortunate in my timing, unlike poor Nick, who's had to grapple with a very tense period in our relationship. I think in the late 80s, we had the best bilateral relations with obviously attendant problems in the last 50 years. And it was more relatively open. We could invite and did invite dissidents and reformers and government and party officials sitting around the same table, talking about political reform. My wife produced the play Came Mutiny Court Martial with Charlton Heston as director, and so these kind of things could never take place today. Relatively open. Even then, though, there were ups and downs, and there were sometimes they take a step forward on economic and political liberalization, then a step back. I won't go into detail because of time, but there were 2 foreshadowings. So it was a much more colorful and more productive relationship in terms of exchanges and economic activity and high-level visits. And we began to build that up so we'd have a hedge in case we ever lost the Soviet glue that held us together when the Soviets were threatening the Chinese. But there were 2 episodes, and then I'll be brief on this, that foreshadowed what was coming. In June 1988, 1 year before the Tiananmen Square massacre, Betty and I went out to talk to students at Beijing, what became known as Democracy Salon, not realizing how sensitive this was. And we were very careful, and we even praised Deng's reforms. But 3 days later, the then ambassador of China to the US came with a personal note from Deng Xiaoping to me, which is unheard of, reprimanding me for going to meet with these students without checking with him first. I went back firmly but politely saying, we wouldn't do that to your ambassador. People wanted to visit Fletcher, for example. We wouldn't make them check in advance. I want to meet your young people and many Chinese. So I'm going to continue what I'm doing. All my speaking engagements and think tank visits were canceled for 2 weeks. So it showed their nervousness even in June 1988. And then finally, when new President Bush came in February 1989, a few months before Tiananmen, I can't do justice to this episode, but to show his concern for human rights, we invited some dissidents to a banquet that Bush hosted for the Chinese, made sure they were not at a prominent table, but sending a signal. At the last minute, the Chinese threatened not to have their leaders attend as long as these dissidents came, which of course was outrageous. It was finally resolved, we thought, but we then turned out they blocked them from coming, Fang Lejure being a famous dissident in particular, which blew up the summit. So Deng was prepared to blow up a summit with his old friend Bush because he was so nervous about these people attending. And I could go into further detail, but I want to make sure you get on with your program. But those showed you that even in that period of relative openness and great relations, things were getting nervous for the leaders and beginning to simmer underground, and exploded, of course, in the spring of 1989.
Well, I'd have loved to go into further detail, and maybe we might during Q&A. This is a
Yes, we
historian's
can.
dream.
Right.
But it is also a good opportunity we've got some context and a set of baselines for the relationship today. So Kelly, over to you, and to Ambassador Burns.
I would like to consider this the beginning of this conversation, and we hope that Ambassador Lord will come spend some more time with us here at the school soon. So now it's a great pleasure for me to turn to Ambassador Burns, our current U.S. Ambassador to China. And Nick, you came to this post after a very distinguished career in government that included stints dealing with parts of the world other than China. How did that experience prepare you for your current ambassadorship?
Well, Kelly, thank you, and good morning to everybody at Fletcher. I just wanted to say congratulations to Fletcher School on its 90th anniversary. One of the great pleasures of my 12 plus years at Harvard was to teach Fletcher students, because our students can cross-register, and every single one of them was impressive. Some of them became my teaching assistants, many of them now friends and serving in the US government and in banking and all around the world. So Fletcher is one of the great schools of international relations in the world. You've got one of your great graduates in Ambassador Winston Lord, a very good friend of mine. So I just wanted to say, Kelly, it's a real pleasure to be with all of you this morning, especially Ambassador Lord. We got to know each other when he was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. So he ran our policy in the entire region following his ambassadorship. And I was the State Department spokesperson. We flew around together, the world together, for a couple of years, and I learned a lot from him and still am doing that. Kelly, and you and I have been friends for a long time, Kelly, through the Harvard-Fletcher connection. And I was a diplomat who spent a lot of time in the Middle East, in West Africa, in Europe. 5 years on the Soviet Union at the White House, the former Soviet Union, when it crashed and burned in December 1991. But I spent a lot of time in some of those jobs, particularly as Undersecretary of State, working with the Chinese on United Nations affairs, on the Afghan war, on Iran's nuclear program. So knew people like Sui Chong-kai, who was Vice Foreign Minister, later became ambassador to the United States. And I went several times early in my career. It was a real eye-opener with Secretary George Shultz to China in '88. I was actually with President Bush on the trip that Winston talked about in February 1989, that very dramatic trip in the first 30 days of President Bush 41's presidency. So I knew China, but I didn't know China as well as many of the people who work with me now at the embassy, career China experts with Mandarin. My wife, Libby, and I'm speaking to you from our ambassador's residence, where Win and Betty Bao Lord once lived. And we're struggling students of Mandarin. So I'm catching up with a lot of my peers here who spent their entire lives as China hands. But I would say you can't be a practicing diplomat in the world and not encounter China. We are the two strongest militaries in the world. We're the two strongest economies. We're, I think, really the only two countries in the world with true global reach. If you think about China's Belt Road Initiative, President Xi just had a summit last week with world leaders to mark the 10 years of the Belt Road. And of course, given the American alliance system and the strengthening of that system under President Biden's leadership, our alliance with Japan fundamentally stronger, our alliance with the Republic of Korea, and of course, the Japan-Korea relationship coming much further than anyone thought at the Camp David summit earlier this autumn. The very dramatic turnaround in the Philippines, where President Marcos has now turned back to the United States and embraced our military alliance. Of course, Australia, you saw the Australian Prime Minister just in the White House the last 2 days, a state dinner, the development of AUKUS, this very important strategic arrangement for the long-term military cooperation between Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the development of the Quad, where India, Japan, Australia, and the United States are now coalescing. All this is happening because China has been challenging the status quo in the Indo-Pacific. It's been very aggressive in the Spratly and Paracel Islands of the South China Sea. We saw that against the Philippines just a couple of days ago. Very aggressive against the Japanese, who administer the Senkaku Islands of the East China Sea. And of course, the Taiwan Strait, which is such a critical waterway for the global economy. So there's a lot happening in this relationship. I do think we've been able to strengthen the relationship. And a lot of what I did earlier in my career obviously prepared me for the strategic aspects of this job as we confront this very aggressive Chinese government.
So when you became ambassador, Sino-American relations, I think we're at one of the lowest points in decades. And or I think we can characterize them as not healthy. So you walked into a difficult situation, and I'd like you to describe what it felt like walking into that situation, and then how you think things have changed over the year and a half that you've been ambassador.
Well, Kelly, two reflections, and it's a really interesting question to ask. My wife Libby and I, and we're both from the Boston area, by the way, so we've known about Fletcher for a long time. We arrived during zero COVID, the Chinese policy, which imposed mandatory quarantines. So when we arrived, we were immediately shipped off to a hotel in Tianjin just for one night, tested, of course, up and down for COVID. And then we quarantined in our ambassador's residence for 21 days before I could even start the job. And that was typical, that was the rule for anyone arriving in China. The American population, we thought we had about 250,000 Americans living full-time in China pre-COVID. We had at least 100,000 Americans departed between 2020 and just the early part of this year, 2023. Our student population was way down. Kelly, you and I talked about this. We're hoping to get more Fletcher students to China. We had 15,000 American students here in 2016 and 17. We're down to about 350 American students, all of China right now. And so it was a very strange period of American isolation. You couldn't move around the country. In my first 8 months, I could only make 2 trips, one to Wuhan and one to Shanghai, because there were periodic lockdowns where you couldn't leave Beijing. And if you tried to leave, you had to quarantine in the city to which you were going for 10 to 21 days. So it was a very rough start from that perspective. And as you said, Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, as you all remember, in August 2022, about the 6-month mark of my ambassadorship. We very strongly supported her right to visit, by the way. And I have the scars to prove it, because I had countless meetings at the Chinese Foreign Ministry where they called me in to berate me, and I defended the right of the Speaker of the House, a co-equal branch of the United States government, to do what she wanted to do and what she felt was important. So that really put a chill in the relationship. We went for a good 6 months with really no high-level contact between the two governments. Things got better at the Bali summit a year ago next month between President Xi and President Biden. But then in early February, 2 days before Secretary Tony Blinken was to visit Beijing as the first American Secretary of State in 5 years, the balloon incident happened, where the Chinese flew this balloon across the entire territory of the United States from Alaska to South Carolina. Another 2 or 3 months of isolation, of no meetings between the governments of any consequence. And frankly, Kelly, and I think I shared this with you when you were here in Beijing a couple of weeks ago, we really hit rock bottom in February, March, and April. And we felt in our government that this was not sustainable. It was not wise for our two governments to be so estranged from each other. And so we convinced the Chinese that we had to have a series of high-level cabinet meetings where we essentially plugged back into each other and reconnected. And since June, Secretary Tony Blinken visited here in June, Secretary Janet Yellen in July, John Kerry, our climate change negotiator, in July. 100-year-old Henry Kissinger arrived at the invitation of Xi Jinping as a sign of openness to the United States. And I met him at the airport. It was about 104 degrees in mid-July and mid-afternoon. He looked great coming off the plane. I had a very productive 4-day visit here where he spent a lot of time with President Xi and spent a lot of time with me, and I was grateful for that and my colleagues at the embassy. And then Secretary Gina Raimondo came in August. Jake Sullivan went to Malta to meet with Wang Yi, the foreign minister, a secret meeting. We revealed it only when it was over. I was with him in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea for a weekend of talks. And then two other things happened. And forgive the long-winded nature of this, but it tells you how far we've come back. Senator Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, came to China 2 weeks ago. 3 Democratic senators, 3 Republican senators. That was really my advice. Please come in a bipartisan coalition. And they had a very interesting, very productive meeting with President Xi Jinping. They saw the Chinese leadership. And just an hour ago, I said goodbye to the governor of California, Gavin Newsom. He was at my house for a reception. I spent the whole week with him here. He saw President Xi Jinping on Wednesday, and he saw Wang Yi, and he saw the vice president. So what has happened? I think both governments realized in this flurry of diplomatic contacts that we had to lower the temperature and we had to calm the waters. And indeed, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, is in Washington today, seeing Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, and President Biden. I think we've come back to the realization that despite the thousands of issues that separate us, and some of these are systemic, and they will be separating the United States and China for, I think, well into the next decade. We're competitors, but we should be able to work together and at least communicate together so we drive down the probability of any conflict between us, which neither side wants. It's been a roller coaster in my 20 months here, but I must say, I think as Win Lord obviously found here in his lifelong participation in this relationship, China's a fascinating country. It's a great civilization. Our two countries cannot be estranged from each other. And while we're going to compete and compete fiercely on a lot of issues that separate us, we're trying to engage in a stable way so that we can live together and share the world together into the future. That's a long answer, I know, but it does tell the story of my 20 months here in China.
That's fantastic. Let me try to connect the two conversations. As Ambassador Lord and Professor Khan discussed earlier, Henry Kissinger was pursuing this form of what we now call triangle diplomacy in the run-up to the Shanghai Communique to achieve a balance of power against the Soviet Union at the time and to focus on areas of mutual benefit. So today, there's no question that Xi Jinping is closer to Putin than to Biden. How has the United States driven China towards Russia, or do you think China is solely responsible for this strategic realignment?
Kelly, I think it would be unfair to say that somehow President Obama or President Trump or President Biden have driven China towards Russia. China made this decision, this February 4th statement in 2022 of a no limits partnership. That was a Chinese decision to make. You might take a look at Bob Gates's very interesting foreign affairs article just over the last couple of weeks saying he thinks that there is, and now a loose alignment, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And Bob Gates thinks this is one of the greatest tests for America since the old Cold War. And I personally think he's right. Take a look at Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, my friend's article just in the last couple of days in Foreign Affairs, where he paints a similar picture, but also says the great strength of the United States overseas these days is the glory of our alliances with other democracies in the world. I name them here in the Indo-Pacific, but obviously the NATO alliance, which has been so important in stymieing Putin in his barbaric war in Ukraine, and also to see the European Union and the United States coalesce on China policy. The EU is objecting to what the Chinese are trying to do in Taiwan, the EU objecting to human rights violations in China. So it's true that China and Russia are very close. President Xi and President Putin have met, I think, 49 or 50 times since they've both been in power. It's true that Iran and North Korea are close to the two of them as well. But I'll take our alliance system as a former ambassador to NATO and as someone who understands the Atlantic Alliance and the profound strengthening of our East Asian alliances over the last couple of years. We don't want to see a return to a new Cold War, and we're not trying to contain China. We have a symbiotic economic relationship with China, which in many ways is very important and positive for both countries. But I feel that the United States is making the right decision really to put our emphasis on our democratic alliances. That'll stand us in good stead for the future.
And let me just follow up by asking, when I was in the Obama administration, our philosophy at the time was that we ought to try to engage with China on areas of strategic mutual interest. For example, climate change, area close to my heart, but knowing that we would disagree, seriously disagree on other topics. Do you think that is still possible as we're sort of watching this strategic geoeconomic realignment today?
I do think it's possible. In fact, it's our policy. It's what President Biden wants us to do. He and President Xi Jinping agreed at their last in-person meeting in Bali 11 months ago that we were going to compete. And of course, we had to manage that competition so that it was fair and it never descended into conflict. And that obviously is a critical aspect of our relationship. But they agreed that our interests were aligned on several major global issues. And the first among them, Kelly, is the one where you've done so much good, both as a professor, as a dean, but also as a negotiator, and that's on climate change. John Kerry, of course, has a very good practical relationship with Xie Zhenhua, his Chinese counterpart, and Governor Newsom spent in all of his meetings, and I was with him in all of his meetings this week, most of his time talking about the fact that we had to come together on climate change and have more aggressive ambitions, both for 2030 in terms of the lowering of carbon emissions, but also 2060 and 2050 in terms of net neutrality. And I do think we've made progress on climate change. We agreed we'd work together on global public health, on food security, which has been such a terribly important and critical issue, given the lack of the flow of grain out of the Black Sea because of the war. And we agreed we'd cooperate on fentanyl, the fact that most of the precursor chemicals come from China, from Chinese black market firms, not the government, into the drug cartels in Mexico that comprise the fentanyl, that make fentanyl the leading cause of death of Americans 18 to 49. So we do have this engagement agenda. We take it very seriously. And it's another way that we have to, no matter what your views are on China, whether you're a hawk or whether you're someone who thinks we ought to be working more closely with China, there are issues that are going to separate us, and they're serious issues. The growth in China's nuclear weapons levels, the Chinese aggressiveness towards India and its neighbors in Southeast Asia, and their appeal to the United States to help them deal with that problem. The massive difference in our beliefs about human freedom, about individual rights, the human rights violations that we see in China. There are differences, but there are also issues that bring us together. And so, we have to be able to do two things at once. We've got to be able to compete. And at the same time, Kelly, as you suggest, and you're right about this, and this is our policy, we're going to have to engage as well. That's a complex equation to balance. It's not easy, but it's our job. And I think it's the right policy for our country.
Great. Well, I'm mindful of the time, so I want to give you two an opportunity to ask each other a question, and then we're going to open it up for the audience. So we have two microphones here, and people can line up. So let me see. Winston, do you want to go first and ask a question of Nick?
Sure. A couple of quick comments on what Nick said, though. First, in our global agenda items with China, I would add artificial intelligence is something I hope we can talk to them about, as well as nuclear weapons, given their growing arsenal. And I won't take the time now, but I agree with what Nick said about the Sino-Soviet alliance, and I would point out it's a near-term tactical problem, but over the long run, I'm not worried about Sino-Soviet comedy and close partnership. It's just not going to happen. Nick, there's a recent book out about Chinese underground historians and artists. There's an Evan Osno's piece about the unrest, particularly of young people and disillusionment. Have you picked this up, and how serious is it? And does it represent any possible challenge to the regime?
Well, I'm looking forward to talking to Ian Johnson more about his extraordinary book, looking at the history of the dissident movement. And I think Evan Osnos is one of our most perceptive and well-informed journalists on China. His book, Age of Ambition, which he wrote some time ago, is a masterpiece. I have read his New Yorker article. I commend it to everybody. Evan was here over the summer. I talked to him about his piece. He quotes me in it. At the very end, about this tricky balance that we have. You know, when your question about public attitudes in youth, it's so hard to answer. This is, as you know very well, this is a rather opaque government, and they're very good at keeping their own counsel. It's not a government that's going to broadcast its innermost views, or you find the innermost views of the government in the newspapers, in a state-controlled press. I find that, you know, if you look at this generation of Chinese who are at Fletcher School or the Kennedy School or other schools, they're living better than their parents did or their grandparents ever could have imagined. China has become, just trying to think about things, how I would describe the average Chinese view of its own country, they're enormously proud of the strides that their country has made. And yet I think many of them who've had some experience studying at a place called like Fletcher or any of our other universities in the United States have had a very different experience of living in a free society, of living in an institution like your academic institution that prizes independence of thought and critical thinking, and really the obligation to dissent, the obligation to disagree in a civil way. That's what we prize about American academia and American society. So, you know, I think the regime, the government here, I should say, is well entrenched. The party is strong, the leader is strong, but you do see signs of course, in a nation of 1.4 billion people, you do see episodes when people openly disagree. And we saw that last autumn in a series of demonstrations, which, you know, may have had a role in the decision to end the zero COVID policy. That was really very difficult for the Chinese, that policy that had been very difficult for the Chinese people, especially in the lockdown in Shanghai. So that's my answer. It's a partial answer to a question, Win, that we'd have to look at in a much more examined way over many months. But let me ask you, because Kelly's invited me to ask you a question. What advice do you have for the United States? I mean, you're someone I deeply respect. You have a longer view of this relationship, you and Secretary Kissinger, than anybody else. And it goes back a half a century. And I found in government what I found in academia when I taught at the Kennedy School. It's always good to ask smart people for advice. You have to be open enough to take it.
Well, I'm going to give you a rather boring answer because I really do approve of the Biden administration approach to China. I say this behind your back, not just to be polite in front of it. I'd give you guys, because what you're doing is about right, is what I'm saying. I give you an A-. The only reason, in the first place, I'm a very tough grader. Almost nobody gets an A for me. Like Fletcher. There's one hole in the approach. There's one that's being fixed, and then there's one unknown. The hole is trade policy in Asia. The Democrats and Republicans have protectionist elements. Globalization did have some bad effects. In any event, by getting out of the major trade agreement in Asia and not having a real alternative, we're trying very hard in specific areas, but we're not opening up the US market. And to compete with China in the global South, where they have so much clout economically, this is a great disadvantage. So I don't know how you fix that. I hope you will be able, whether it's Belt and Road response or whether it's a trade and investment response, I would hope that can be fixed. I do approve of the de-risking versus decoupling. Small areas with high walls, it's going to be very tough to do that because of intertwined supply chains and other problems. We shouldn't throw out the economic benefits baby with the bathwater of legitimate security concerns. The problem that's being fixed is our approach to the global South. For too long, we sort of had an emphasis, you pick us or pick China. Countries don't want to do that, as you pointed out, because of their economic concerns, particularly with China, but their security concerns where they lean toward us. But we're adjusting our message as far as I can see, and basically saying, we're not asking you to pick, but we do think our model is better, and we're willing to compete on that model. And then the unknown is what I've already mentioned. I approve of the concept. We have legitimate concerns on security, whether it's semiconductors or other areas. And both on investment and trade and exports, we've got to be careful but we ought to use scalpels, not machetes. And we ought to try to implement the approach of picking a few key areas and shielding them, but not interrupting, which is impossible anyway, given our intertwining and our friends around the world decoupling. So that's the big unknown. It's a huge challenge. I approve of it. But overall, the approach of the Biden administration is correct. It's firm without being belligerent. You're trying to establish guardrails. You're dividing our problems into three sections, as you've already indicated. There's a few areas like human rights in Taiwan we're just not going to solve. We're going to have to agree to disagree, kick the can down the road, hope over time they will be ameliorated. In the meantime, build guardrails so that we don't stumble into conflict and accidents, particularly given Chinese naval and air harassment around Taiwan and the South China Sea. So those problems you just manage. Then there's a vast area, economic, technological, public diplomacy, where we can compete. And I think with self-confidence, given our relative assets over the Chinese and their relative problems, if we get our act together here at home and our democracy in shape, both soft and hard power, and that's a big if. But there's this vast area of competition. Then finally, there's the few areas you mentioned where we can converge. And as I said, I would add artificial intelligence to that package. So invest at home, both the soft and hard power, a model for democracy and the future infrastructure and other needs we need. Align ourselves. The Biden has done a terrific job in Europe and Asia with alliances generally, but also balancing China in particular. And then competing with self-confidence. China's a challenge, but let's not get hysterical. Let's treat this as a Sputnik moment, get our act together and compete with self-confidence.
Well, Win, thank you for the A-. We'd rather have an A. I'm wondering if we don't have an A because the one thing that Win and I have disagreed on for 30 years is that I'm a native born member of Red Sox Nation, and Win, unfortunately, is with the evil empire. Yeah. That's the only thing we disagree on. But
why don't we
just
talk about 1986 for a while, shall we?
well, another time. But let me just say, on the issue that you mentioned of trade, and I think this is important for the Fletcher audience, we have a $690 billion two-way trade relationship. China is now our third largest trade partner after Mexico and Canada, our two free trade neighbors. And Janet Yellen said this year when she came to China, she said it would be disastrous if we ever try to decouple these two economies. That is not our policy. In fact, I've spent a fair amount of my time, including this week with Governor Newsom, talking up trade between the United States and China in those areas where that trade does not impinge on our national security. And I'm working with companies from all over the United States to try to help them compete. So we want to see the trade continue. We do have a de-risking policy, as does the European Union. In fact, the term comes from the president of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and that is that the pandemic taught us that you don't want to be dependent on powers with which you have a rivalry and a competition for critical materials and critical minerals, and you want to have them closer to home in supply chains with friendlier countries. So that de-risking makes a lot of sense. I don't know a lot of people who would disagree with it. And the one thing we said about trade, about 1% of our trade involves dual-use technologies that, if exported by an American company to China, would essentially strengthen the PLA's ability to compete with our military, and we're simply not going to do that. And so we have taken over the last 13 months now, export actions that deny, for instance, the export of advanced semiconductors, AI chips into China, because they'll just be used by the military in a way that's going to be detrimental to US interests. It's a very sensible policy. And the Chinese complain about it, but here's the real story. They began de-risking before we did, and they have the same kind of dual use restrictions for their companies that we have. And so we feel good about our position on trade, and you're going to see us be robust champions of continued trade in those areas that don't hurt our national security.
I was trying to trade with other countries, multilateral pacts. One last point, I'll let Kelly get in here. De-risking, which I fully approve of, and I admit the complexities, applies, as I know you feel, to exchanges with China as well. And we've got to get more Chinese coming here, Americans going there, and that applies to scientists as well. There's some security concerns, but it's in our interest to have as many exchanges as possible, in addition to the governmental exchanges that you're establishing to stabilize the relationship.
When we just, in our embassy and consulates here in the US mission to China, we just granted 93,000 visas to Chinese students to study in the United States. There are about 300,000 Chinese students now, compared to 350 Americans in China. So we need some help from the Chinese authorities in getting visas for American students here. And frankly, we need American universities to reopen their summer language programs, their junior year programs. Right now, NYU, Shanghai, Johns Hopkins are really the two flagship schools. I hope Duke in the future in reopening their operations. I think that's a test for Tufts as it is for other American universities.
Don't forget Yale, or a common background as well. Sure.
You two cannot see the room, but we have a big line of people who want to get in and ask.
Okay.
And there we go, great. And we only have like 3 minutes. So here's what I'm
Oh,
gonna do.
gosh. Sorry.
That's okay. I'm gonna take 2 questions at a time and we'll do 2 rounds. This is gonna take us a couple minutes over, and I'm conscious that Ambassador Burns is very late at Beijing time, so I don't want to keep him over.
No
Let
problem.
me take 2 at a time and we'll do at least 2 sets. So let's start right here and then we'll go to you. And make sure you keep your questions short so that we can get to more people. Yeah.
Thank you both for your time. My name is Charles and I lived in Taiwan for 6 years before coming to Fletcher. My question for Ambassador Lord is, what was your experience with the denormalization of relations between America and Taiwan? And a question for both is, how has Taiwan's transition to democracy changed the relationship between America, Taiwan, and China?
Okay, and now let's go to Sam. I see. One of my advisors.
Hello, this question is more for Ambassador Burns. You've spoken on visits from officials other than diplomats like Newsom, Schumer, and Pelosi. What are the pros and cons or benefits and drawbacks of officials holding talks whose official business isn't necessarily to do so? And do you ever see the other way happening, where local and state government Chinese officials are coming to see Biden? I also looked at an article around Newsom's visit being characterized as a surprise visit. And we also talked about secret meetings with China over the course of history. So why does it have to be that way?
Okay, I'll go first on Taiwan. I think one of the great success stories, bipartisan over many administrations, the last 50 years, has been our Taiwan policy. It's been tense, it's been up and down. But from the very beginning, we've done a balancing act. And in the course of 50 years, Taiwan, thanks primarily to its own people and enlightened leaders, has become an economic powerhouse. Its security has been protected, and it's become a democracy, as you pointed out. And for all these reasons, to get the last part of your question, this has strengthened our own interest and desire to preserve Taiwan's autonomy and being able to determine its future for itself peacefully with the mainland. So Taiwan, it was a shock when we opened up, but they've done extremely well ever since. Meanwhile, we've been able to move ahead with China. And you talk about denormalization. The convention of wisdom is that we made big concessions when we went to China in the 70s. We had to address the China issue. We constructed a one China policy that maybe 3 people in the world understand. It's very elusive and elastic, but it served our purposes of keeping this dual track alive through all these years. In exchange for that, in the president's trip, the Chinese allowed us to continue, after saying for 22 years we could only talk about Taiwan and we wouldn't improve relations in any other way until that was solved. They allowed us to continue diplomatic relations, a defense treaty, troops on the island. And so I would argue that the Chinese had to make courageous moves as well as the US, and I think we've been well served ever since. The last point I'll make without elaborating, because of time, is Taiwan is a very dangerous issue. I'm worried about possible blockades of offshore islands, but there's zero chance that China will invade Taiwan in the near or middle future. It's just not going to happen, but I don't have the time to explain why. If I just lay that out there.
Thank you so much.
I'm happy, but I realize the time. By the way, poor Nick is the guy with the schedule. I'm prepared to go way over our time limit for the students, but I don't want to force Nick to have to do that or mess up your schedule.
That's very kind of you, Winston. I'm fine. Kelly, I can stay as long as you, until you want to kick us out. So don't worry about the time. Charles, thank you for your question. You know, Taiwan requires, we could design a good course at Fletcher that would allow us to really delve into the Taiwan issue. I just say two things. The one China policy has not changed. The policy developed by President Nixon, Secretary Kissinger, and Ambassador Winston Lord. And that remains our policy to this very day. Point one. Point two, there's a lot to admire in Taiwan. It's a free society. It's a society of tremendous entrepreneurialism. Some of the great companies of the world, like TSMC, are there. And we're governed by one imperative, and that's the peaceful resolution of a dispute between the People's Republic and Taiwan across the Taiwan Strait. We want that to be adjudicated peacefully. And of course, we don't accept the increased air and naval activity of the PRC over the last 14 months since Speaker Pelosi's visit. And under the Taiwan Relations Act, of course, it's our responsibility to provide defensive weaponry to Taiwan for its defense. So that's just the broad brush, but that's a very important flashpoint, an issue in the US-China relationship, needless to say. Sam, I hope I understood. There was some static on the line. I hope I understood your question. Let me attempt an answer. You let me know if I didn't answer it correctly. We're going to see, I think, several high-profile Chinese visitors to Washington, D.C. Wang Yi, the foreign minister and director of the Foreign Affairs Commission, the senior diplomat of China, is in the White House today. It was in the State Department yesterday. We'll see other ministers of the Chinese government going to Washington to reciprocate the visits that American secretaries have made to Beijing. I think it's also very important that we engage not just at our federal government level, but at what Gavin Newsom would call the subnational level. We need governors. And Gavin Newsom was the very first American governor to appear in China, to visit China in 4.5 years. I hope we'll have governors of both political parties. We're nonpartisan out here at the American Embassy. We want to see Republican and Democratic governors come out. I think it's very important that track 2 continues. And we've seen a bit of that happening, the pace picking up. And I know Fletcher professors and students are involved in that. That's connecting to Chinese counterparts. That's healthy. And certainly members of Congress. As I said before, we've only had the one congressional delegation 2 weeks ago, led by Majority Leader Schumer. So we need an engagement strategy that involves the American society. Of course, our government's fundamentally engaged in this, but we need the rest of society to do it as well. We are two great societies that need to learn more about each other because we were pulled apart by the COVID crisis.
Great, thank you. Let's go to the next 2 questions.
So,
Introduce yourself.
yeah, good morning, Ambassador Lord, and good evening, Ambassador Burns. And I'm actually an international student from China. My name is Yu Han, and I want to thank Ambassador Burns for granting my student visa. So that is quite good. My question is recently I haven't read the news about what's happening in Israel and Palestine. It's kind of heartbreaking to read the news. And we have noticed that both the United States and China has exercised their veto powers in the Security Council. So currently there's no resolution from the Security Council to address this particular issue. So my question is as a senior US diplomat, what do you think, how should China and the United States to work together to address this issue in this difficult time? Thanks so much.
Okay, let's take the second question.
Hi, I'm Sarah Vaughn, second-year student. My question is about the Belt and Road Initiative, which came up, and I'm wondering how the United States' diplomatic efforts have kind of tried to respond to this. Has the Belt and Road Initiative from China affected the United States in other areas, particularly Central Asia? and other surrounding regions and countries? And how has that kind of impacted the United States' efforts within China itself? Thank you so much.
Kelly, do you want me to try? Do you want me to answer those? Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm very happy you have a student visa. We want the door to be open to foreign students in the United States. Of course, they enrich our universities. I taught a course on great power politics at the Kennedy School for about 10 years. I couldn't imagine teaching that course without Chinese students in the class. We always had Chinese students because you're a big part of the balance of power in the world. On Gaza and Israel, we've had substantial contacts with the Chinese government on this issue. We have some differences. China says it supports a two-state solution, so do we. But we point out that Hamas does not accept a two-state solution. It's in favor of a one-state solution, the destruction of the state of Israel. So obviously, you've seen our president, President Biden, and Secretary Blinken be unreserved and unequivocal in our support for the state of Israel, the right of Israel to defend itself. It was attacked viciously 3 weeks ago. The bloodiest day in the history of the state of Israel was 3 weeks ago tomorrow. And every country has a right to defend their borders, to defend their civilian population in a situation like this, and Israel has that right. You've also seen the United States contribute $100 million to support humanitarian efforts in Gaza for the Palestinian community there and in the West Bank. You have not seen that effort from China or many other countries that are speaking about the crisis now. And you've seen both President Biden and Secretary Blinken talking in very, very straightforward terms about the need to rush humanitarian assistance into Gaza to the Palestinians. And we're working in a way that I think few other countries are with the Egyptians to try to open that border at Rafah and with the United Nations as well. So all of these questions are great questions. They require a lot more time for adequate discussion. Sarah, you've asked a really good question about Belt Road. I think by last calculations, the Chinese have spent well over $1 trillion in executing this program. It's a signature program over the last 10 years. We do have a lot of concerns about it. We think that many of the recipients, not all, but many, have experienced high levels of indebtedness to the Chinese government. That shouldn't have happened. President Biden has been working in our own government, but also with the European Union to try to establish not so much a competitor, but just an alternative program that the EU and US would work on together to provide long-term and sustainable lending to countries for infrastructure projects. And the last thing I'd say on this is, I think Winston was right to raise the issue of how should we approach the global South? The last thing we want to do is recreate what we had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the US-Soviet competition for the allegiance of what was then known in the parlance of that day, third world countries. In the global South, these countries have a right to expect that the international system will be fair, that they'll have a stronger voice in the IMF and the World Bank, that they shouldn't have to live with high levels of indebtedness. And so President Biden and Secretary Blinken have been saying, and they've been very active with the global South countries, we're not asking you to choose. You can decide to have a relationship with China and the United States. We think the value proposition of our relationship is going to stand the test of time.
Thank you. All right, we are 10 minutes over, and so I'm gonna, with apologies to those who still have questions, bring us to a close. I want to say we will be hosting alumni celebrations of our 90th worldwide in the coming months. I actually leave tonight for India, and my next stop after that will be Dubai. And in early 2024, we will celebrate in Tokyo, London, San Francisco, Washington, DC, Athens, and Mexico City before concluding our celebrations next May for commencement and reunion weekend. Pick up a flyer outside or visit the website to see the details of the schedule. And before we close, I want to use this occasion where we've reflected on diplomatic relations between two very important countries to make an important announcement about Fletcher. Today, we are relaunching and rebooting the Murrow Center with a new name and a renewed mission. With the blessing of the Murrow family, generous advice from the Murrow Board of Advisors, and approval from the Provost, I am glad to announce that the Murrow Center will now be called the Edward R. Murrow Center for Global Diplomacy. The Murrow Center will thus broaden its focus to include diplomatic history, journalism, public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, small state diplomacy, and training in the tools of diplomacy, whether they be used in government, the private sector, intergovernmental organizations, or the nonprofit center. So the Murrow Center will now be the center of gravity on all aspects of global diplomacy here at Fletcher, and I hope the world. It will be a home for current students, a locus for scholarship, and a vibrant convening space for practitioners. And speaking of convening, on Monday, you can join via Zoom the Soft Power Summit, which is one of many new programs that our new executive director, Don Heflin, who's sitting right here in the front, and Professors Tara Sonnenschein, Elizabeth Leek, Carlos Alvarado, and Michael Klein, all of whom are in the room, are leading. And with that, I want to give a really warm thanks to Ambassador Lord, Ambassador Burns. Thank you so much for celebrating this momentous day with us. And to everyone who's joined via Zoom and here in the room, thank you for helping us celebrate 90 years at Fletcher.